My name is Deborah Martin. I'm 34 years old. And last Thursday, at Thanksgiving dinner, my father stood up in front of our entire family, slammed his fist on the mahogany table, and screamed at me, "Stop playing soldier, Deborah! You're embarrassing this family with your little costume games." The turkey went cold. 23 relatives froze mid-bite. My nephew Tyler's fork clattered against his plate, and there I sat, in my dress uniform, the same uniform I'd worn to receive the Purple Heart 2 years ago in a field hospital in Kandahar, watching my father's face twist with disgust as he looked at me like I was nothing more than a child playing dress-up. But here's the thing they didn't know, couldn't know, refused to see. In the breast pocket of that costume was a small velvet box containing a piece of metal that told a story my family had never bothered to ask about. A story written in blood, shrapnel, and the kind of courage that gets you carried off a battlefield on a stretcher while your unit fights to hold the line. They had no idea that their little soldier girl had taken an IED blast meant for 6 other Marines. They had no idea that I'd spent 4 months learning to walk again, that I still wake up some nights with my ears ringing from explosions that happened 3 years ago. The silence in that dining room in Millbrook was deafening. My mother, Patricia, stared into her cranberry sauce like it held the secrets of the universe. My older brother Jake smirked from across the table, the same smug expression he'd worn since we were kids, when Dad would praise him for throwing a football while dismissing my academic achievements. My sister-in-law Rachel shifted uncomfortably, probably wishing she'd stayed home in Denver instead of flying out for this disaster of a family gathering. And my father, Robert Martin, CEO of Martin & Associates Construction, stood there in his expensive navy sweater, chest puffed out like he'd just delivered some profound truth to the world. The man who'd built shopping malls and office complexes across 3 states, who commanded respect in every boardroom he entered, couldn't see past his own narrow definition of what his daughter should be. To him, I wasn't Staff Sergeant Deborah Martin, recipient of the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Combat Action Ribbon. I was just his disappointing daughter, who'd chosen the military over the marketing degree he'd paid for, who'd chosen combat boots over high heels, who'd chosen to serve something bigger than herself instead of following the neat little path he'd laid out for me. The worst part? This wasn't the first time. This was just the loudest, most public humiliation in a lifetime of them. Every family gathering, every holiday, every phone call home had been peppered with his disapproval. When I'd graduated from basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, he'd called it summer camp for misfits. When I'd been promoted to sergeant, he'd asked when I was going to get a real job. When I'd been deployed to Afghanistan, he'd told people at his golf club that I was going through a phase and would come to my senses eventually. But Thursday night was different. Thursday night, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the way my 10-year-old niece Emma looked at me with confusion, like she couldn't understand why Grandpa was yelling at Aunt Debbie. Maybe it was the fact that I'd driven 8 hours from Fort Carson just to be here, just to try one more time to bridge the gap between us. Or maybe it was because I'd finally realized that no amount of trying, no amount of hoping, no amount of sacrificing my own dignity would ever be enough to earn his respect. As I sat there, feeling the weight of every stare, every whisper, every uncomfortable shuffle around that table, I thought about the moment that changed everything. The moment when a roadside bomb in the Helmand province sent me flying 15 feet in the air and into a world of pain I'd never imagined possible. I thought about waking up in that field hospital, disoriented and broken, with a Navy corpsman telling me I'd saved lives, that my quick thinking and sacrifice had kept my unit intact. I thought about the ceremony where General Harrison had pinned that Purple Heart to my chest and called me a hero. But sitting in my childhood home in Millbrook, surrounded by people who shared my DNA but couldn't see who I really was, I felt anything but heroic. I felt invisible. I felt dismissed. I felt like that 18-year-old girl who joined the army to prove something to her father, only to discover that some people are determined never to see you, no matter how bright you shine. The tension was suffocating. Uncle Frank cleared his throat awkwardly. Cousin Beth stared at her phone like it might transport her anywhere but here. And through it all, my father, Robert Martin, just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for me to apologize, to back down, to be the good little daughter who knew her place. That's when I reached into my pocket and felt the velvet box. That's when I realized this Thanksgiving was about to become unforgettable for reasons none of them could imagine. That's when I decided to show them exactly what this costume really meant. Would you have stayed silent, or would you have stood up and shown them the truth? Drop your answer in the comments, because what happened next didn't just change Thanksgiving dinner. It changed everything.
You think that Thanksgiving dinner was the first time my father dismissed my service? Think again. That explosion of humiliation was just the crescendo of a symphony he'd been conducting my entire life. In the Martin household, there was always a clear hierarchy, and I was never at the top of it. See, in my family, success had a very specific definition. It wore three-piece suits, carried leather briefcases, and came with corner offices overlooking the Denver skyline. My brother Jake understood this perfectly. Harvard MBA, married to a doctor, living in a mansion in Cherry Hills Village with 2 kids who played lacrosse and violin. He was the golden child, the one who followed the blueprint my father had drawn up for all of us. And then there was me, the daughter who chose fatigues over formal wear, who traded a marketing career for military service, who picked duty over dollars. From the moment I enlisted at 18, I became the family disappointment, the cautionary tale my father would tell at his business dinners. Well, Deborah's going through her rebellious phase. She'll figure it out eventually. But here's what my father never understood, what he refused to acknowledge. While he was building shopping centers and strip malls, I was building something too. I was building strength, courage, and a bond with my fellow Marines that ran deeper than blood. While Jake was climbing corporate ladders, I was climbing mountains in Afghanistan, carrying wounded soldiers to safety. While my family was collecting paychecks, I was collecting brothers and sisters who would die for me, and I for them. The irony was crushing. My father demanded respect for his empire, concrete and steel structures that would crumble within decades. But he couldn't see the real empire I'd built, an unbreakable foundation of honor, sacrifice, and service that would last forever. He measured success in square footage and profit margins. I measured it in lives saved and missions completed. That Thanksgiving night, as I sat there with the Purple Heart burning a hole in my pocket, I realized something profound. For 16 years, I'd been trying to translate my world into his language. I'd been trying to make him understand that what I did mattered, that who I'd become was worthy of his pride. I'd been begging for crumbs of approval from a man who'd never bothered to learn what I'd actually accomplished. The Purple Heart wasn't just a medal. It was proof. It was validation written in sacrifice and sealed with blood. It was everything I could never say, couldn't explain, hadn't been allowed to share with a family that saw my service as a phase rather than a calling. As I looked around that table at faces I'd known my whole life, faces that reflected confusion, embarrassment, and indifference, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to explain myself anymore. I wasn't going to justify my choices or apologize for my path. I was going to show them exactly what their disappointing daughter had earned through pain, courage and sacrifice. I was going to let that Purple Heart speak the words I'd been unable to say for years. Because sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say, it's what you reveal. And what I was about to reveal would shatter every assumption they'd ever made about Staff Sergeant Deborah Martin. The question is, when someone has spent years diminishing your achievements, do you keep trying to convince them with words? Or do you let your actions speak for themselves? Drop a medal in the comments if you think some truths are worth fighting for, because what happened next proved that respect isn't given, it's earned, and sometimes it has to be claimed. You want to know when this pattern really started? I was 12 years old, standing in the kitchen of our old house on Maple Street in Millbrook, watching my father beam with pride as he hung Jake's Little League Championship trophy on the mantel. 23 trophies that kid had won by the time he was 16. Baseball, basketball, tennis, golf, each one carefully polished and displayed like crown jewels in our living room shrine to his athletic greatness. That same day, I'd brought home a certificate recognizing me as the top student in my 7th grade class. Straight A's across the board, perfect attendance, student council president. I remember holding that certificate, still warm from the printer, waiting for my moment to share my achievement. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching Dad rearrange Jake's trophies for better lighting, listening to him call Grandpa Woy to brag about his son's latest victory. When I finally approached with my certificate, Dad glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds. "That's nice, sweetheart. Why don't you put it on the refrigerator with the grocery list?" The refrigerator. Well, Jake's achievements got the mantle. Mine got buried under shopping lists and pizza coupons. That night, lying in my bed, I made a promise to myself that someday I'd do something so extraordinary, so undeniably impressive, that even Robert Martin would have to acknowledge it. High school was more of the same relentless pattern. Jake was the quarterback, the homecoming king, the boy every parent in Millbrook wished they'd raised. Friday nights belonged to him. The entire family would pile into Dad's Suburban and drive to Millbrook High School to watch the Golden Boy throw touchdown passes. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Gazette, featured Jake on the sports page at least twice a month. Dad kept every single clipping in a leather scrapbook that he'd proudly show to anyone who visited our house.
Meanwhile, I was valedictorian. I'd earned a full academic scholarship to Colorado State University. I'd founded the debate team and led them to state championships 3 years running. I'd organized food drives that fed half the families in our county during the recession. But none of that ever made Dad's scrapbook. None of that ever earned me a Friday night spotlight or a proud phone call to the relatives. The breaking point came during my senior year. I'd just been accepted to West Point, not Colorado State, but the United States Military Academy. Do you understand what that means? Out of thousands of applicants, they'd chosen me. They'd looked at my grades, my leadership experience, my character, and decided I had what it took to become an Army officer. I was 17 years old, and the most prestigious military institution in the country wanted me. I remember running home with that acceptance letter, my heart pounding with excitement and hope. This was it. This was the achievement that would finally make Dad see me, really see me. I burst through the front door of our house on Elm Drive, we'd moved to the nicer part of town by then, and found Dad in his study, going over construction blueprints. "Dad," I practically shouted, waving the letter above my head. "I got in. West Point accepted me. I'm going to be an Army officer." He looked up from his blueprints with the most disappointed expression I'd ever seen cross his face. Not proud, not excited, disappointed. "Deborah," he said, his voice heavy with that particular tone he reserved for my biggest failures. "We've talked about this. You're throwing away your future. You have a full ride to Colorado State. You could major in business, join the company after graduation, actually make something of yourself." Make something of myself? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Dad, this is West Point. This is one of the most elite institutions in the world. They chose me out of thousands of applicants." They chose you to be a soldier, Deborah, to take orders and march around in the mud. Is that really what you want, to waste all that intelligence on playing war games? Playing war games. Those words hit me like a physical blow. My father, this man I'd spent my entire life trying to impress, saw my greatest achievement as a game. He saw my calling to serve my country as a waste of intelligence. He saw everything I dreamed of becoming as fundamentally worthless. That night, I called Jake, hoping my big brother might help me understand Dad's reaction. Jake was at Harvard by then, already the business success story Dad had always envisioned. "Look, Deb," he said, using that patronizing tone he'd perfected over the years. "Dad's not wrong. The military is fine for people who don't have other options, but you're smart. You could do anything. Why choose something so limiting?" Limiting. My own brother thought my ambition to serve my country was limiting. The family I'd grown up with, the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, saw my dreams as character flaws that needed correcting. But here's what they never understood, what they couldn't comprehend from their safe suburban bubble. Some of us aren't built for corner offices and quarterly reports. Some of us hear a different calling, feel a deeper pull towards something that matters more than profit margins and stock portfolios. Some of us understand that true success isn't measured in dollars earned, but in lives touched, in service rendered, in sacrifice willingly given. I went to West Point, despite their disapproval. I excelled there, graduated in the top 10% of my class, earned my commission as a second lieutenant. I called home after the graduation ceremony, hoping 4 years might have changed their perspective. Dad's response? "Well, I hope you got that rebellion out of your system. There's still time to apply for business school." The pattern was set in stone. No matter what I accomplished, no matter how I distinguished myself, I would always be the daughter who'd chosen wrong, who disappointed them, who was wasting her potential on playing soldier. For years, I told myself their opinion didn't matter. I told myself I was serving something greater than family approval. But deep down, in the quiet moments between missions and training exercises, their dismissal carved away at something essential inside me. Their inability to see my worth, to value my service, to understand my sacrifice, it created a wound that never quite healed, a question that never quite got answered. Why wasn't I enough? The moment that crystallized everything happened during my first deployment to Afghanistan. I'd been in country for 3 months, stationed at Forward Operating Base Thunder in Helmand Province, leading a marine logistics unit through some of the most dangerous supply runs in the region. We were moving critical medical supplies to an outpost that had been under siege for 6 days, and I'd volunteered to lead the convoy because 2 Marines were going to die without those blood bags and morphine. It was supposed to be a routine mission. 12 vehicles, 43 Marines, a 17-mile route we'd traveled dozens of times before. But nothing in Afghanistan was ever routine. 6 miles from our destination, our convoy hit an IED that had been buried in a pothole we'd driven over countless times before. The explosion flipped our lead Humvee, killed Sergeant Rodriguez instantly, and left Corporal Matthews with injuries that would require 17 surgeries and end his career at 22 years old.
I pulled Matthews out of that burning vehicle while insurgents opened fire from 3 different positions. I dragged him behind a concrete barrier, applied pressure to wounds that were bleeding faster than I could stop, and called in air support while coordinating our defense. For 6 hours, we held that position. 6 hours of incoming fire, of watching good Marines bleed, of making life and death decisions that would replay in my mind for years to come. When the dust settled and the medevac helicopters finally arrived, I'd saved 4 lives that day. Matthews survived because I'd kept him conscious and stable until the medics could take over. Private Johnson lived because I'd applied a tourniquet to his mangled leg before he could bleed out. 2 other Marines made it home to their families because I'd held that line, because I'd refused to retreat, because I'd done my job when everything went to hell. 3 weeks later, I called home from the satellite phone at our base. I needed to hear familiar voices, needed some connection to the world I was fighting to protect.
My mother answered on the third ring, and I could hear the relief in her voice when she realized it was me. We talked for maybe 10 minutes about safe topics. The weather in Millbrook, her garden, Aunt Helen's new hip replacement. Normal things that felt like lifelines when you're living in a war zone. Then Dad got on the line. "How's the adventure going, kiddo?" That's what he always called my deployments, adventures. Like I was backpacking through Europe instead of dodging Taliban fighters and IEDs. I tried to explain what had happened, tried to share the weight of what I'd been through, the responsibility I was carrying, the lives that had been in my hands. "Dad, we hit an IED last week. I had to pull wounded Marines out of burning vehicles. I saved 4 lives." I needed him to understand. I needed him to see that what I was doing mattered, that the daughter he'd dismissed as playing soldier was actually being a soldier, making decisions that meant the difference between families getting their children back or getting folded flags. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Well, I'm glad you're safe, sweetheart. Listen, Jake just closed a $15 million deal for the company. Biggest contract we've ever landed. We're thinking about expanding into Utah. You should think about coming home soon and joining the family business. This military thing has been fun, but it's time to get serious about your future." Fun? He called my deployment, my service, my sacrifice fun? While I was living in a concrete bunker, eating MREs and watching friends get shipped home in body bags, my father was worried about Utah real estate opportunities. While I was learning to sleep through mortar attacks and wake up ready to lead Marines into danger, he was concerned about when I'd stop playing games and get serious about my future. The worst part wasn't even his dismissal. It was what came next. "Jake's been asking about you," Dad continued. "He thinks you'd be perfect for the marketing department. Use that leadership experience you're getting to help grow the business, turn this military phase into something productive." Something productive? As if saving lives wasn't productive? As if serving my country wasn't valuable? As if the leadership experience I was earning by keeping Marines alive in a combat zone was only worthwhile if I could later use it to sell office buildings and shopping centers? I hung up that phone and walked outside into the Afghan desert, where the temperature was already climbing toward 115 degrees, even though it wasn't yet 8 in the morning. I stood there in the dust and heat, surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire, and realized something that would haunt me for years to come. My father had more respect for Jake's real estate deals than he did for my military service. He valued profit margins more than my willingness to die for my country. 2 months later, Jake visited me when I was home on leave. We met for dinner at Romano's, the Italian place in downtown Denver where our family had celebrated every birthday and graduation for as long as I could remember. He showed up in a $1,000 suit driving a BMW that cost more than I'd make in 2 years of military service. The conversation was pleasant enough at first. He asked about Afghanistan, pretended to be interested in my stories, ordered the most expensive wine on the menu. But then halfway through dinner, he leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk and said, Deb, I've been thinking about what you said on the phone about saving those Marines and everything. That's really admirable, it is. But don't you think it's time to think bigger? I mean, you're what now, 25? Most of your college friends are already established in their careers, building something real. When are you going to stop playing hero and start building a future? Playing hero? My own brother, the person who'd known me longer than anyone on earth, thought my service was an act. He thought my deployment, my willingness to sacrifice everything for my country and my Marines, was some kind of performance I was putting on instead of serious, meaningful work.
That dinner ended with Jake picking up the check and offering to put in a good word for me with Dodd about joining Martin and Associates. "The offer's always open," he said as we walked to our cars. "Family business, family loyalty. Think about what really matters, Deb." I drove home to my tiny apartment in Colorado Springs that night, past billboards advertising Jake's latest development project, past signs bearing the Martin and Associates logo that had become synonymous with success in the Denver metro area. And I realized that no matter what I accomplished in the military, no matter how many lives I saved or missions I completed, my family would always see me as the daughter who chose wrong, who valued service over success, who was too stubborn to see that real achievement meant profit and prestige. The concrete evidence was undeniable. They respected money more than courage, business deals more than bronze stars, profit margins more than Purple Hearts. The financial reality of military service hit me hardest during my second deployment. I was stationed at Camp Leatherneck in Afghanistan, serving as a platoon leader for 42 Marines, responsible for convoy security operations that kept supply lines open between forward operating bases. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and critical. Without our missions, isolated outposts would run out of ammunition, medical supplies, and food within days. My base salary as a staff sergeant was $38,000 a year. With combat pay and hazardous duty allowances, I was making maybe $45,000 annually, while dodging roadside bombs and coordinating life or death missions in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. And meanwhile, Jake had just been promoted to Vice President of Development at Martin & Associates, pulling down a six-figure salary plus bonuses for selling luxury condominiums to Denver's elite. The contrast became painfully clear when I called home to ask for help with something that should have been simple. My truck, a beat-up 2008 Ford Ranger that I'd bought used before my first deployment, had finally given up while I was overseas. The transmission died, the engine was making sounds that mechanics described as terminal, and the repair estimate exceeded the vehicle's actual worth. I needed reliable transportation when I returned from deployment in 6 weeks, but military pay doesn't exactly leave room for unexpected major purchases. I'd been saving every penny I could, living in base housing, eating at the mess hall, avoiding the expensive off-base entertainment that drained other soldiers' bank accounts. But even with combat pay, I had maybe $8,000 in savings. Not enough for a reliable used car that wouldn't leave me stranded on the highway between Colorado Springs and Denver. So I did what any daughter might do. I called home and asked my parents for help. Not a gift, not charity, a loan. I'd calculated exactly how much I needed, worked out a payment plan that would have the money repaid within 18 months, and prepared to offer my savings as collateral if they needed that assurance. Mom answered the phone at their house in Millbrook, the one they'd renovated with imported Italian marble and a kitchen that cost more than my annual salary. I could hear the television in the background. Dad was watching the Golf Channel, probably relaxing after another day of expanding the family real estate empire. "Hi, honey." Mom's voice was warm, genuinely happy to hear from me. "How are things over there? We saw in the news that there was some trouble in your area last week." The trouble she'd seen on CNN had been a coordinated Taliban attack on our base that lasted 14 hours and left 3 Marines wounded, but I didn't correct her casual description. Instead, I explained my situation: the dead truck, the need for reliable transportation, my request for a loan that I'd pay back with interest if they wanted that assurance. There was a long pause. I could hear her covering the phone, muffled conversation with Dad in the background. When she came back on the line, her tone had shifted from warm to carefully diplomatic. "Oh, sweetheart, you know we'd love to help, but this just isn't a good time financially. The company is expanding into 3 new markets, and we've got all our capital tied up in development projects. Maybe you could look into military programs for vehicle loans or ask your base about transportation assistance." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The Martin & Associates website, which I'd looked at just days earlier, boasted about their record-breaking quarter and their aggressive expansion strategy backed by substantial capital reserves. Dad had bought Mom a new Lexus for her birthday 3 months ago. They'd just returned from a 2-week vacation in Tuscany that probably cost more than my entire annual housing allowance. But before I could respond, Mom continued. "Besides, honey, Jake is having some cash flow issues with his new house. You know how expensive those mortgage payments are on a place in Cherry Hills Village. We're helping him with the down payment on a second property, an investment condo downtown that should provide excellent rental income. Family has to help family, you know." Family has to help family. The irony was suffocating. Jake, who made triple my salary, needed help buying investment property while I was asking for assistance replacing a vehicle I needed to get to work defending my country. Jake's cash flow issues involved luxury real estate speculation, while mine involved basic transportation to fulfill my military obligations. I hung up that phone and sat in my concrete bunker, listening to the generators humming outside and the distant sound of helicopters returning from night missions. Around me, Marines were cleaning weapons, writing letters home, playing cards to kill time before the next patrol. These were kids from small towns and inner cities, most of them making even less than I was, all of them sacrificing everything for something bigger than themselves. And here I was, a combat veteran with multiple decorations, unable to afford a reliable car while my family financed my brother's real estate investments. The comparison became even more stark 3 weeks later when I received a care package from home. Inside were the usual items: beef jerky, magazines, toiletries, along with a newspaper clipping from the Denver Business Journal featuring a full-page article about Jake's latest project. Martin and Associates breaks ground on $50 million mixed-use development, the headline read. The photos showed Jake in a hard hat and tailored suit, shaking hands with the mayor while Dad beamed in the background. At the bottom of the care package was a handwritten note from Mom. Thought you'd want to see how well your brother is doing. We're so proud of his success. The whole family will be set for generations thanks to his business sense. Hope you're staying safe over there. Love, Mom. The whole family will be set for generations. I read that line over and over, trying to understand the logic. Jake's business success would benefit the whole family, but my military service was just a personal adventure that had nothing to do with them. His achievements were family victories, while mine were individual pursuits that they tolerated rather than celebrated. That night, I wrote Jake an email asking if he could help with the truck situation. I explained that I wasn't asking for family money, just wondering if he might co-sign a loan or provide a reference that would help me get better financing terms. I'd helped him with his college application essays, written recommendation letters for his fraternity applications, even let him use my perfect credit score as a reference when he'd applied for his first apartment. His response came back within hours. Hey, Deb, wish I could help, but I'm totally leveraged right now with the new development project. Have you thought about maybe buying a motorcycle instead? Cheaper, better gas mileage, and probably more practical for someone who's always moving around with the military. Just a thought. Hope you figure something out. A motorcycle in Colorado for a female Marine who would be driving between military bases in winter conditions. Jake's solution to my transportation crisis was to suggest I risk my life on a motorcycle because it was cheaper than the reliable vehicle I actually needed. I ended up taking out a high-interest military loan and buying a used Honda Civic with 150,000 miles on it. The monthly payments ate up nearly a third of my take-home pay, but at least I had transportation. Meanwhile, Jake's latest Instagram post showed him at a charity gala, raising money for underprivileged youth while wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than my car. The message was crystal clear. My family would move heaven and earth to help Jake accumulate more wealth, but they couldn't spare the resources to help me meet basic needs while serving my country. His financial problems were family emergencies that required immediate assistance. Mine were personal challenges I was expected to solve alone. The economic divide wasn't just about money. It was about values, priorities, and what they considered worthy of family investment. The cruel irony of my situation became clear during my 3rd year of service when I finally understood why I couldn't simply tell my family what I really did in the Marines. It wasn't just military protocol. It was a binding oath that could literally cost lives if I broke it. Most people think Marines just follow orders and shoot guns. They have no idea that some of us work in intelligence, that we handle classified information that could compromise ongoing operations if it fell into the wrong hands. My actual job title was intelligence analyst, but even that generic description barely scratched the surface of what I really did every day. I spent my days analyzing intercepted communications, identifying high-value targets, and briefing commanders on Taliban movement patterns that our special operations teams use to plan raids. The intelligence reports I wrote directly influenced mission planning that determined whether American soldiers came home alive or in body bags. I had security clearance that took 18 months of background investigations to obtain, and I'd signed documents that made it a federal crime to discuss specific details of my work with anyone who didn't have the same clearance level. So, when my family asked what I did in the military, I had to give them the same generic answer I gave everyone without security clearance: logistics and administration. It was technically true. Intelligence work involved a lot of logistics and administrative tasks, but it was also completely misleading about the actual scope and importance of my responsibilities. The paradox was maddening. The very thing that made my work critically important, the classified nature of intelligence operations, was the same thing that made it impossible to defend myself against my family's dismissive attitudes. I could have told them that generals relied on my analysis, that my reports influenced major strategic decisions, that my work directly saved American lives. But revealing any of those details would have violated my security oath and potentially compromised ongoing operations. Meanwhile, Jake could tell anyone who would listen about every detail of his real estate deals. He could brag about the contracts he negotiated, the profits he'd generated, the buildings he'd developed. His work was public, visible, measurable in ways that everyone could understand and appreciate. When he closed a $15 million deal, there were newspaper articles and press releases celebrating his achievement. When I identified a Taliban weapons cache that prevented American casualties, the operation was classified, and my contribution remained invisible. The security restrictions extended far beyond just work details. I couldn't mention which countries I'd been deployed to, which bases I'd served at, or which units I'd worked with. I couldn't discuss specific training I'd received, equipment I used, or missions I'd supported. Hell, I couldn't even post photos on social media that might reveal too much about military operations or intelligence capabilities. This created an impossible situation during family gatherings. While Jake regaled dinner parties with detailed stories about his business successes, I had to sit quietly and let people assume I spent my days filing paperwork and answering phones. When relatives asked about my military service, I could only offer vague generalizations that made my work sound boring and unimportant. The frustration reached a breaking point during Christmas dinner 2 years into my service. We were at my parents' house in Millbrook, and Dad was holding court in the dining room, bragging to Uncle Frank and Cousin David about Jake's latest promotion at Martin & Associates. Jake had just been named Director of Strategic Development, a position that came with a company par, expense account, and profit-sharing benefits that would make him independently wealthy before he turned 35. "That boy has vision," Dad announced, raising his wine glass in a toast. "He sees opportunities that other people miss. That's what separates winners from followers in this world, the ability to think big and take calculated risks." Uncle Frank nodded approvingly. "You must be proud, Robert. Both your kids turned out successful, though I have to admit, I don't really understand what Deborah does in the military. Logistics, right? Moving supplies around?" I felt my jaw clench as Dad's expression shifted to that familiar look of mild embarrassment mixed with parental obligation. "Yes, well, Deborah has always been more of a support role type. She's good with details, organization, that sort of thing. Nothing wrong with being behind the scenes, of course. Not everyone can be a leader like Jake." Behind the scenes, support role. Not everyone can be a leader. Each phrase hit like a physical blow, especially since I knew that at that very moment, Marines in Afghanistan were receiving intelligence briefings based on analysis I'd completed just weeks earlier. I was leading a team of 6 analysts who depended on my guidance and expertise. I was attending strategy meetings where lieutenant colonels asked for my professional opinion on enemy capabilities and intentions. But I couldn't say any of that. I couldn't explain that my support role involved making life and death decisions that affected combat operations. I couldn't mention that my intelligence reports were read by people with stars on their shoulders who trusted my judgment enough to base major tactical decisions on my recommendations. Instead, I had to smile and nod while my own father described me as someone who wasn't leadership material, someone who was content to work behind the scenes, while other people like Jake, did the real work of leading and decision-making. The security oath that protected my fellow Marines and preserved operational security had become a prison that trapped me in my family's misconceptions. Every classified report I wrote, every intelligence briefing I delivered, every strategic recommendation I made was invisible to the people whose approval I still, despite everything, desperately wanted. The most painful part was knowing that this catch-22 had no solution. I could either honor my oath and remain misunderstood, or break federal law and betray the trust of every person who depended on military intelligence to stay alive. There was no middle ground, no way to selectively reveal just enough to change my family's perception without compromising operational security. So I remained silent, letting their assumptions calcify into unshakable beliefs about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The oath that made me trustworthy enough to handle classified information had also made it impossible to prove my worth to the people who mattered most to me. It was a sacrifice within a sacrifice. Serving my country meant not only risking my life, but also accepting that my own family would never understand the true nature of that service. The lies my family created to fill the silence of my classified work became more elaborate and entrenched with every passing year. What started as simple misunderstandings evolved into a full-blown family mythology that painted me as the disappointing daughter who'd chosen an easy path over real responsibility.
The story they told went like this. Deborah had joined the military because she couldn't handle the pressure of civilian competition. She'd picked a safe government job with guaranteed benefits and predictable hours because she didn't have the entrepreneurial spirit or risk tolerance required for real success. She pushed papers around a desk somewhere far from any actual danger, probably spending her days processing supply requests and updating spreadsheets, while taxpayers footed the bill for her comfortable, low-stress career. This narrative became so ingrained in family gatherings that they'd repeat it in front of me like I wasn't even there. During my cousin Sarah's wedding reception at the Broadmoor Resort, I sat at the family table, listening to my Aunt Margaret explain my career to her new in-laws. "Oh, Deborah works for the government," she said, with that particular tone people use when they're being politely dismissive. "She's in the military, but not like the soldiers you see in movies. She does administrative work, keeping records, processing paperwork, that sort of thing. Very stable, very predictable. Some people prefer that kind of security over the uncertainties of private sector competition." The new in-laws nodded politely, clearly filing me away in their mental category of boring government worker. Meanwhile, Jake was regaling the next table over with stories about his latest real estate acquisition, a shopping center in Boulder that would generate millions in revenue over the next decade. Everyone hung on his every word, asking thoughtful questions about market analysis and investment strategies, treating him like the successful businessman he'd become. But the family mythology went deeper than just misunderstanding my job description. They'd created an entire psychological profile to explain why I'd made such disappointing choices. According to family legend, I'd always been risk-averse and uncomfortable with confrontation. I was the daughter who preferred following rules to making decisions, who chose the military because it would tell me what to do rather than requiring me to think independently. This characterization was so far from reality that it would have been hilarious if it hadn't been so painful. The woman they described as risk-averse had volunteered for combat deployments. The daughter they saw as uncomfortable with confrontation had led Marines through firefights and made split-second tactical decisions under enemy fire. The person they thought preferred following orders had earned the respect of commanding officers who trusted her to operate independently in high-pressure situations. The most damaging part of their narrative was how it affected my relationship with extended family and family friends. At every wedding, funeral, birthday party, and holiday celebration, I had to listen to well-meaning relatives offer me career advice based on their misunderstanding of my situation. Uncle Thomas, who ran a small accounting firm in Grand Junction, cornered me at my grandfather's funeral to suggest I consider transitioning to civilian bookkeeping.
You've got all that experience with military paperwork, he said earnestly. I bet you could make good money doing tax preparation or small business accounting, more stable than relying on government employment, and you'd have real growth potential. Cousin Linda, who worked as a high school principal, suggested I look into teaching positions when my military service ended. You'd be perfect for classroom management, she assured me. All that experience following protocols and maintaining order. Have you thought about getting your teaching certificate? We need people who understand structure and discipline. These conversations were torture. Here were people I'd known my entire life, people who genuinely cared about me, offering advice based on completely false assumptions about my capabilities and experience. They saw me as someone who needed simple, structured work environments because they believed I lacked the skills for more challenging positions. They thought I was marking time in the military until I could find real civilian employment that matched my supposedly limited abilities. The financial assumptions were equally insulting. During a family barbecue at Jake's new house in Cherry Hills Village, a 5-bedroom mansion with a 3-car garage and heated swimming pool, my father made a comment that revealed exactly how they viewed my economic situation. It's good that Deborah chose a career with government benefits, he told Jake's new neighbors, who'd stopped by to welcome them to the exclusive neighborhood. She'll never make serious money, but at least she'll have health insurance and a pension. Some people value security over opportunity. Security over opportunity? Never make serious money? The implications were clear. They saw my military career as a consolation prize for someone who couldn't compete in the real economy. They thought I'd chosen guaranteed mediocrity over the risks and rewards of private sector success. The truth was exactly the opposite. Military service, especially in intelligence and combat roles, required constant adaptation to unpredictable and dangerous situations. I'd taken enormous personal and professional risks, made decisions with incomplete information under extreme pressure, and succeeded in environments where failure could mean death. The skills I'd developed, strategic thinking, crisis management, leadership under fire, were the exact kinds of abilities that translated to high-level civilian success. But my family had constructed such a complete alternate reality that contradictory evidence simply bounced off their preconceptions. When I mentioned during one family dinner that I'd been selected for advanced training at Fort Huachuca, they assumed it was some kind of remedial program to help me catch up with better qualified soldiers. When I told them about receiving commendations from commanding officers, they figured it was the military equivalent of Employee of the Month awards, nice gestures that didn't reflect actual achievement.
The most insidious aspect of their mythology was how it became self-reinforcing. Every family member who heard the story from my parents accepted it as fact and then repeated it to other relatives, adding their own embellishments along the way. By the time the narrative had circulated through our entire extended family, I'd become the cautionary tale about what happens when someone lacks ambition and settles for mediocrity. This created a social dynamic where defending myself would have seemed delusional. If I'd tried to correct their misperceptions, if I'd attempted to explain that my work was actually complex and important, they would have seen it as sad bragging from someone trying to inflate her modest accomplishments. The family had collectively decided who I was, and any evidence to the contrary was dismissed as wishful thinking or self-delusion. So I sat through years of family gatherings, listening to relatives discuss my career like I was a charity case who needed their sympathy and advice. I smiled politely while they offered suggestions for transitioning to the private sector and finding work that matches your skill set. I nodded appreciatively when they praised me for knowing your limitations and choosing stability over risk. all while knowing that I was making decisions that influenced multi-million-dollar military operations, leading teams of highly trained professionals, and earning the respect of people who understood exactly what I was capable of achieving. The family mythology had become my prison, and my security oath had made it impossible to break free. The psychological toll of living two completely different lives, the respected intelligence analyst at work and the family disappointment at home, began eating away at something fundamental inside me. It wasn't just frustration or anger anymore. It was a deeper erosion of my sense of self-worth that crept in during the quiet moments between missions and deployments. The breaking point came during my 4th deployment to Afghanistan, when I received news that would forever change how I saw myself and my place in the world. I was working late in the intelligence center at Bagram Air Base, analyzing communication intercepts that suggested a major Taliban offensive was being planned against coalition forces in the Kunar province. The work was intense, requiring me to piece together fragments of intercepted conversations, satellite imagery, and human intelligence reports to build a comprehensive threat assessment. At 0300 hours, while I was deep in analysis that would ultimately save dozens of American lives, my secure communications device buzzed with a message from my commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hayes. "Martin, report to my office immediately. Bring your personal effects." My heart stopped. In military parlance, being told to bring your personal effects usually meant one of two things. You were being reassigned, or something terrible had happened back home. I'd grabbed my gear and walked across the compound, my mind racing through possibilities. Had something happened to my parents? Was Jake hurt? Had there been an emergency that required my immediate return? Colonel Hayes was waiting in her office with Chaplain Rodriguez and Major Thompson from personnel. The expression on their faces told me everything I needed to know before anyone spoke a word. Someone I cared about was dead. "Star Sergeant Martin, I'm afraid I have difficult news. We received word from the Red Cross that your grandfather, Roy Martin, passed away yesterday evening from a heart attack. I'm authorizing emergency leave so you can return home for the funeral. Transport leaves in 6 hours." Grandpa Roy, the only person in my family who'd ever really seen me, who understood that my military service was something to be proud of rather than tolerated. He'd served in Vietnam as a Navy corpsman, and he'd been the one family member who never questioned my choice to serve. When everyone else was dismissing my career as playing soldier, Grandpa Roy would pull me aside at family gatherings and ask real questions about my work, the kinds of questions I could actually answer without violating security protocols. "How are you holding up under the pressure, kiddo? Leadership's tough, especially when you're responsible for other people's lives. Your grandmother worries about you over there, but I tell her you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Some people are born to serve something bigger than themselves." He'd been a medic in the Mekong Delta, had earned a Bronze Star for pulling wounded Marines out of a rice paddy under heavy fire. He understood what military service really meant, what it cost, and why it mattered. More importantly, he understood that the silence required by security clearances didn't mean the work was unimportant. It often meant exactly the opposite. The flight home was a nightmare of military transports and commercial connections that took 36 hours. I arrived in Denver exhausted, emotionally drained, and dreading the family dynamics I'd have to navigate during an already difficult time. Grandpa Roy had been the buffer between me and my father's disappointment, the one person who could redirect family conversations away from my career mistakes and toward topics that didn't leave me feeling defensive and diminished. The funeral was held at St. Matthew's Catholic Church in Millbrook, the same church where I'd been baptized and confirmed, where Grandpa Roy had served as an usher for 43 years. The service was beautiful and heartbreaking. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects to a man who'd touched lives throughout the community. Vietnam veterans served as pallbearers, and the honor guard performed a flag-folding ceremony that brought tears to everyone's eyes.
But it was the reception afterward that destroyed something inside me. We gathered at my parents' house, and relatives who hadn't seen each other in years used the opportunity to catch up on family news. Jake held court in the living room.
telling stories about his latest business ventures while accepting condolences for our loss. He wore his grief well, playing the role of successful grandson who'd made Grandpa Roy proud through his achievements in real estate development. I stood in the corner, still in my dress uniform because I'd come straight from the airport, listening to family members share their memories of Grandpa Roy. And that's when I heard something that shattered my heart into pieces I'm not sure ever fully healed. Aunt Margaret was talking to Jake about how proud Grandpa Roy had been of his success. "He bragged about you constantly," she told Jake. "Every time I saw him at the grocery store or the pharmacy, he'd have some new story about your latest project. He kept newspaper clippings about your buildings in his wallet, you know. He'd show them to anyone who would look." Then she turned to me with that sympathetic smile people reserve for disappointments. "He worried about you, though, Deborah. He used to tell me he hoped you'd find your way eventually, maybe settle down and start a family instead of moving around with the military all the time. He said he understood why you needed to rebel when you were younger, but he hoped you'd grow out of it and find something more stable." The words hit me like a physical blow. Grandpa Roy, the one person I'd thought understood my service, who I'd believed respected my choices, had seen my career as a phase I needed to grow out of. He'd worried about me the same way everyone else did. He kept Jake's newspaper clippings in his wallet while hoping I'd eventually come to my senses and choose a more conventional path. I excused myself and walked outside into the Colorado evening, needing air, needing space, needing to process this revelation that had just destroyed my last refuge of family support. I sat on the porch steps where Grandpa Roy and I had shared countless conversations about service and sacrifice, and realized that even those conversations had been colored by his hope that I'd eventually abandon the military for something he considered more appropriate for a young woman. The psychological impact was devastating. If Grandpa Roy, a combat veteran who'd earned his own Bronze Star, couldn't see the value in my service, then maybe my family's dismissal wasn't just ignorance or misunderstanding. Maybe I really was wasting my potential, throwing away opportunities that other people could see clearly, while I remained stubbornly blind to my own mistakes. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by high school trophies and college acceptance letters, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if everyone else was right. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe my insistence that my military service mattered was just self-delusion. Maybe I was clinging to a fantasy about my own importance while the people who loved me could see the truth I refused to acknowledge. For the first time in my military career, I began to question everything. Not just my family's perception of my choices, but the choices themselves. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was wasting my life playing soldier, while Jake was building something real and lasting. Maybe my stubborn pride was preventing me from seeing opportunities that were obvious to everyone else. The doubt was corrosive, eating away at the confidence I'd built through years of successful military service. It made me second-guess decisions I'd been making instinctively, question my judgment in ways that could have been dangerous in a combat environment. When everyone you love believes you're making a mistake, it becomes almost impossible to maintain faith in your own path. I returned to Afghanistan carrying that doubt like a cancer, wondering if the life I'd built was really just an elaborate way of avoiding the adult responsibilities that Jake had embraced so successfully. The mission that would change everything began 3 weeks after I returned from Grandpa Roy's funeral.
My analysis went straight to Lieutenant General Patricia Morrison, the commanding general for all coalition forces in eastern Afghanistan. Based on my intelligence assessment, she made the decision to reinforce all 3 outposts, reposition quick reaction forces, and coordinate with Afghan National Army units to intercept the Taliban fighters before they could launch their attack. The operation, codenamed Iron Shield, was executed with surgical precision. Special Operations Forces, guided by my intelligence analysis, intercepted Haqqani's fighters at 3 separate locations as they moved toward their targets. The Taliban commander himself was killed in a firefight near the Pakistani border, and his attack plan died with him. The after-action reports were classified, but the results were undeniable. 437 American service members went home to their families instead of coming home in flag-draped coffins. The intelligence analysis I'd produced, working around the clock with fragments of intercepted communications and satellite imagery, had prevented what would have been the worst single day of American casualties in the entire Afghan conflict. 3 days later, I received an email that I read 17 times before the words fully sank in. It was from General Morrison herself. Staff Sergeant Martin, your intelligence analysis prevented a catastrophic loss of American lives. Your work exemplifies the highest standards of military professionalism and directly contributed to the success of Operation Iron Shield. I have recommended you for the Bronze Star Medal for meritorious service in a combat environment. Your dedication and analytical expertise saved the lives of 437 American service members. Well done, Marine. The Bronze Star, one of the highest decorations for non-combat military achievement, awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in a combat zone. I stared at that email until the words blurred, trying to reconcile the reality of what I'd accomplished with the doubt that had been eating away at me since Grandpa Roy's funeral. But even as I felt a surge of validation, I knew this achievement would remain invisible to my family. The operation was classified. The intelligence methods were classified. The specific threat we'd prevented was classified. I couldn't tell my parents that a 4-star general had personally commended me for saving hundreds of lives. I couldn't explain that my paperwork had prevented the worst military disaster of the entire war. Instead, when I called home to check in, Mom asked her usual questions about whether I was eating enough and staying warm, while Dad mentioned that Jake had just been featured on the cover of Colorado Business Magazine as one of Denver's rising stars under 40. The contrast was surreal. I just received recognition from the highest levels of military command for preventing a massacre while my family celebrated Jake's appearance in a local business publication. The Bronze Star ceremony took place 6 weeks later at Bagram Air Base. Colonel Hayes pinned the medal to my uniform while my fellow intelligence analysts stood at attention, many of them with tears in their eyes because they understood exactly what this recognition meant. The citation, read aloud to the assembled Marines, described my exceptional analytical skills and tireless dedication that had directly prevented significant American casualties through superior intelligence analysis. After the ceremony, Colonel Hayes pulled me aside for a conversation that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Staff Sergeant Martin, in 23 years of military service, I've never seen intelligence work of this caliber. You didn't just analyze data, you saved lives. General Morrison specifically requested that I tell you this commendation will be part of your permanent record, and she's personally recommending you for accelerated promotion. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the ceremony, I received a letter addressed simply to the Marine intelligence analyst who saved my son. Inside was a handwritten note from Susan Crawford of Topeka, Kansas. My son, Lance Corporal Michael Crawford, was stationed at Combat Outpost Keating when your intelligence prevented that Taliban attack. I don't know your name, and I probably never will, but I wanted you to know that because of your work, my son came home alive. He's getting married next month to his high school sweetheart. They're planning to name their first child after the anonymous intelligence analyst who gave them a future together. Thank you for bringing my boy home. I sat in my concrete bunker at Bagram holding that letter, finally understanding something that had eluded me through all the family gatherings and dismissive comments and disappointed sighs. My worth wasn't determined by my family's ability to understand what I did. It was determined by the lives I saved, the Marines who'd made it home because of my work, the families who still had their children because I'd chosen to serve something bigger than myself. The Bronze Star wasn't just a medal. It was proof that my choices mattered, that my service had meaning, that the sacrifices I'd made were worthwhile regardless of whether my family could see their value. For the first time since Grandpa Roy's funeral, the doubt began to lift. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. and no amount of family disappointment could change the fundamental truth that I'd found my calling in service to others. The only question now was whether I'd ever find the courage to show my family who I really was, not the disappointing daughter they'd imagined, but the decorated Marine who'd earned the respect of generals and saved hundreds of lives through skill, dedication, and sacrifice. That opportunity would come sooner than I expected, in a way that would change our family dynamics forever.
The moment of complete transformation came exactly 18 months later, on a cold Thursday evening in November, at my parents' Millbrook estate. It was Thanksgiving 2019, and I'd just returned from my final deployment in Afghanistan, a deployment where I'd earned the Purple Heart after an IED blast nearly killed me while I was conducting field intelligence gathering with a special operations team. The explosion happened on October 15th, during what was supposed to be a routine intelligence collection mission near Kandahar. Our convoy was gathering real-time intelligence on Taliban supply routes when the lead vehicle hit a buried explosive device that had been specifically positioned to target American forces. The blast launched me 15 feet through the air and embedded shrapnel in my left shoulder, my back, and both legs. I spent 6 weeks at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, undergoing surgeries to remove metal fragments and repair damaged tissue. The Purple Heart ceremony took place in my hospital room, with my commanding officer reading the citation while I lay connected to monitors and IV drips. The medal itself was placed in a small velvet box that I'd carried with me through every medical transport and recovery facility, a tangible reminder of what I'd sacrificed for my country. But my family knew none of this. They thought I was finishing up my overseas assignment and finally coming home to figure out what I was going to do with my life. Dad had already started making calls to business contacts, trying to line up interviews for entry-level positions that might be suitable for someone with Deborah's administrative background. The Thanksgiving gathering at my parents' house was larger than usual. 23 family members crowded into the formal dining room, including Jake and his wife Rachel, my cousins from Denver, and several family friends who'd been invited to join our traditional family celebration. The house looked like something from a magazine spread. Imported Italian leather furniture, crystal chandeliers, and original oil paintings that cost more than most people's cars. I arrived wearing my dress blue uniform, the same uniform I'd worn to receive the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. The medals were pinned to my chest in perfect regulation order. The Purple Heart with its distinctive purple ribbon and gold profile of George Washington, the Bronze Star with its red, white, and blue striping, and several other commendations that told the story of my military service to anyone who understood what they represented. The reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. Mom met me at the door with that forced smile she reserved for situations that embarrassed her. "Deborah, honey, why are you wearing that costume? We're having a nice family dinner. Couldn't you have changed into something more appropriate?" Costume. After everything I'd been through, after all the sacrifices I'd made, she still saw my uniform as a costume. I walked into the living room where the family had gathered for pre-dinner drinks, and conversations died mid-sentence as people stared at my uniform and medals with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. Jake was the first to speak, and his words cut like a knife. "Seriously, Deb, what's with the full military theater? Are you trying to make some kind of statement?" He gestured toward my medals with his wine glass, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescending amusement. "I mean, we get it, you were in the military, but this feels like you're trying a little too hard to be the center of attention." The center of attention? That's what he thought this was about, some desperate bid for family approval through military pageantry? He had no idea that the Purple Heart on my chest represented nearly dying for my country, that the Bronze Star recognized intelligence work that had saved hundreds of American lives. Dad's reaction was even worse. He looked at me with genuine disgust, like I was a teenager who'd shown up to a formal dinner in ripped jeans and a concert t-shirt. "Deborah, this is embarrassing. We have guests here, important guests. Tom Henderson from the City Planning Commission, the Johnsons from the Country Club, people who matter in this community. What are they supposed to think when they see you playing dress-up soldier at a family dinner?" Playing dress-up soldier. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Here I was, wearing the uniform I'd earned the right to wear through years of service, displaying medals that represented real sacrifice and genuine heroism, and my own father saw it as embarrassing theater that might damage his reputation with his business associates. The breaking point came when Dad stood up from his leather chair and raised his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Stop playing soldier, Deborah. You're embarrassing this family with your little costume games. We're trying to have a civilized dinner here, not some military parade." The silence that followed was deafening. 23 people, frozen in place, wine glasses halfway to lips, conversations abandoned mid-sentence. My 10-year-old niece Emma stared at me with wide eyes, probably wondering why Grandpa was yelling at Aunt Debbie. Uncle Frank studied his shoes like they contained the secrets of the universe. The guests from the country club shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. And in that moment, something inside me didn't just break. It crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. I wasn't hurt anymore. I wasn't disappointed or angry or desperate for their approval. I was done. Done with their dismissal, done with their embarrassment, done with pretending that their opinion of my service mattered more than the lives I'd saved and the sacrifice I'd made. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small velvet box containing my Purple Heart. The box itself was unremarkable, standard military issue, navy blue velvet with gold embossing. But what it contained was proof of everything they'd never bothered to understand about my service.
I set the box on the mahogany dining table, right next to the crystal centerpiece, that probably cost more than my annual military salary. The sound it made, a soft click against the polished wood, seemed to echo through the room like a gunshot. "You want to know what playing soldier looks like?" I said, my voice steady and quiet. "This is what playing soldier earned me." I opened the box. The Purple Heart lay against white satin padding, its purple ribbon and gold profile catching the light from the chandelier above. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. That's when fate intervened in the form of a knock at the front door. Mom went to answer it and returned with a man in military dress uniform who commanded immediate attention the moment he walked into the room. Colonel James Patterson, my former commanding officer, who'd driven 3 hours from Fort Carson to personally deliver my final service records and commendation letters. What happened next would shatter every assumption my family had built about their disappointing daughter and prove that sometimes the truth is more powerful than any lie they could construct. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.